Section 1 of Favourite Fairy Tales Retold. Recording by James Pinniger. Favourite Fairy Tales Retold by Julia Darrow Cowles. Preface. In bringing together these old classics for children, the author of the book has sought to apply the rule laid down in her preceding book, The Art of Storytelling, and to paint each story against some universal background of truth. The occasional exceptions are the stories of pure fancy or delicious nonsense. None of the stories depict physical cruelty or violence, from which children instinctively shrink. Neither is craftiness or fraud or lying rewarded. Yet the stories are full of romance and adventure, and of the old-time fairy lore which children love. Changes in the original stories have been freely made when necessary to bring them into conformity with the above conditions, for these old folk and fairy tales belong to all peoples and all times, and, as in the olden days, so now, the stamp of the individual storyteller may be renewedly impressed upon them. It is hoped that the stories may prove a source of true joy to the children who read, as well as to storytellers and listeners. J. D. C. End of Section 1. Section 2 of Favourite Fairy Tales Retold. Favourite Fairy Tales Retold. Section 2.
The Three Lemons, from Label A.
Once upon a time there was a prince named Carlino who lived with his father, the king, in the Palace of Rubies. The king was growing old, and he wished, oh how he wished, that his son would marry, and he told his wish to all his people. He must have a wife who is young, and rich, and beautiful, the king said, but more than all this, she must be loving and good. So they searched all the country over for a wife for Carlino, but the prince only ran away to the woods, and declared that he would not marry at all. The king was sad and sorry indeed, but one day a strange thing happened. As the king and the prince sat together at dinner, the prince cut his finger with a knife. 3 drops of blood fell into a dish of cream at the prince's plate. The prince stared into the dish, then suddenly exclaimed, "My father, I see a vision of a beautiful maiden whose skin is as fair and smooth as cream, and whose cheeks and lips are red as these drops of blood. I am going to seek her. When I have found her, I shall marry her, and bring her to the Palace of Rubies." With that, he mounted the most magnificent horse in all the king's stables and galloped away. A long, long time he journeyed. He visited towns and villages, he entered castles and cottages, but nowhere did he see the maiden of his vision. At last, after days and weeks and months of journeying, he came to a place called World's End. There was nothing but a line of shore, and beyond it stretched sea and sky and mist. Carlino looked about. An old man sat on the shore alone. "What sea is this, good father?" asked Carlino. "It is the sea without a shore," replied the old man. "Away beyond the horizon, lost in the mist, is an island. 3 sisters dwell on the island, but none who go there ever come back." "But a prince may succeed where others have failed," said Carlino, and he stepped into a boat which lay on the shore. No sooner was the prince seated than the boat shot through the water like an arrow from a bow. In a short time Carlino came within sight of the mysterious island. Its coast was rough, and its cliffs were rugged, but the moment the boat touched the shore, Carlino began to climb. When he reached the top, he found 3 huts. He knocked at the door of the first. "I can do nothing for you," cried a snarling voice, "but go to my sister who lives beyond." Carlino knocked at the door of the second hut. "I can do nothing for you," cried a plaintive voice, "but go to my sister who lives beyond." Carlino hurried on, and knocked at the door of the third hut. "Perhaps I can help you," cried a pleasant voice, and a young woman opened the door of the hut. Carlino told her his story, and when he had finished she gave him 3 lemons, and a beautiful knife with a handle of mother of pearl. "Take these," she said, "and hasten back to your father, the king. When you reach the borders of your own country, stop at the first spring of water, and there you must cut in 2 these lemons. As you cut each, there will spring forth a beautiful fairy with skin like cream and lips like drops of blood. She will ask you for a drink of water, Give it to her quickly, or she will vanish from your sight. But if the first and the second leave you, be sure to capture the third. If you do not, I can do nothing more to help you. But if you give her the water quickly, she will stay with you and love you, and you shall make her your wife." Prince Carlino thanked the young woman, folded the precious lemons safely in his mantle, and hastened to his boat. He met with many adventures on the way, but at last he reached the borders of his father's kingdom, and came to the spring of water. His heart beat fast as he took his knife and cut the first lemon. Out sprang a wonderful fairy, who asked Carlino for a drink of water. But he, poor fellow, was so amazed at the wonderful sight that he stood a moment as though rooted to the ground, and immediately the fairy disappeared. "Ah, why did I lose so beautiful a creature?" cried Carlino. Then he cut the second lemon. Out sprang a fairy as beautiful as the first, and asked for a drink of water. But again Carlino was so amazed that he moved but slowly, and the fairy disappeared. "Woe is me," cried Carlino, "if I capture not the third!" Then he cut the remaining lemon, and there sprang forth the most beautiful fairy of them all, and before she had finished asking for water, Carlino was upon his knees, offering her a brimming cup. The fairy, whose skin was like cream, and whose lips were like drops of blood, smiled and thanked the prince, and after drinking the water, gave him her hand. Carlino was half afraid that it was a dream from which he would awaken, but the fairy promised to marry him, and to go with him to the Palace of Rubies. "But you must go as a true princess," said Carlino. "Wait here while I hasten to my father. I will return for you with attendants, with horses, and with royal splendour. Then shall you appear before the king in a manner befitting a princess." So Carlino hastened away, and the fairy, feeling frightened at being left alone in the woods, sprang into a tree and hid among the leaves. A few moments later, a black slave came to the spring to draw water. She was ugly of face and of temper, for she had never known anything in all her life but hard labour and abuse. As she stooped to fill her jar, she saw in the clear water the reflection of the fairy's beautiful face. She looked up. "Why are you there?" she cried. The fairy, who had only known love and happiness all her life, and who trusted everyone, replied, "I am waiting for the prince to come and make me his bride." Then a wicked idea came to the mind of the old slave. She would shake the fairy into the stream and take her place in the tree. Then, when the prince came, she would say that she was the fairy, and that a witch had changed her to her present ugly form. She raised her arm to shake the tree, but the fairy understood what she meant to do, and quickly flew away in the form of a dove. When the prince returned, he was quite beside himself with grief and amazement. But the old slave declared that she was the fairy in disguise, and at last he took her to the Palace of Rubies. "I will have no black slaves inherit my throne," stormed the king. But his prime minister told him that the ugly negress was a fairy in disguise, that such changes had often occurred, and that no doubt the bride would become as beautiful as before when the marriage ceremony was performed. So at last the king consented, and preparations for the wedding were begun. But the king and Prince Carlino were in great distress. One day, just before the wedding, Prince Carlino noticed, growing close to the palace wall, a little lemon tree which had not been there before. He asked about it, and the chef of the palace told him. "A dove lighted near the kitchen window, and as I needed one more for our feast I killed it. 3 drops of blood fell upon the ground, and almost at once this lemon tree sprang up." Prince Carlino looked closely at the little tree, and behold, there were 3 lemons on its branches. He seized them and ran to his room, opened the knife, which he always carried, and filled a jewelled cup with water. Then, trembling, he cut the lemons as before, and, as before, a fairy sprang from each. The first and second disappeared, but to the third he offered the cup of water. For the third fairy was his true bride, come back to him again. Everyone in the palace declared that the wicked negress should be put to death, but before this was done, the fairy said to the king, "I am sure you will grant me a wedding gift." The king was so happy that he answered, "I will give you anything that you ask." "Then," said the fairy, Give me the life of this woman now condemned to death." Truly it is a poor gift," said the king, "but I have given my word. But why do you wish it?" he added. "Ah," said the fairy bride, "she has never known anything but hard labour and abuse. I will give her a happier life, and she will find goodness through loving." "My dear," said the king, "now I know of a truth that the bride of Prince Carlino is as good as she is beautiful." So the prince and the fairy were married, and they lived happily ever after. End of section 2. Recording by James Pinniger. Section 3 of Favourite Fairy Tales Retold. Favourite Fairy Tales Retold. Section 3. The 12 Months. From Labourlay. Once upon a time a poor peasant woman was left a widow. She had a daughter whose name was Zloboga, and a little serving maid whose name was Dobrunka. Now Dobrunka was good and kind and as beautiful as she was good, while Zloboga was proud and cruel. Dobrunka was given all the hard tasks and all the scoldings, while Zloboga did only fine stitching and was petted and praised. One day in January there was to be a party in the neighbourhood. Zloboga could go, for though her mother was so poor, she had a fine party dress. But Dobrunka could not go, for she had nothing fit to wear. Dobrunka was very unhappy, but neither Zloboga nor her mother cared for that. When the day of the party came, Zloboga declared that she must have a bunch of violets to wear. "They would just match the colour of my dress," she said. "But violets do not blossom in January," exclaimed Dobrunka. "I care not," said Zloboga, with a stamp of her foot. "You are to find me a bunch of violets, and do not come back till you bring them." Poor Dobrunka was pushed out into the cold, and the door was closed and bolted behind her. She hurried to the woods, for she knew not where else to go. The wind blew and the snow drifted, but as she reached the bare woods, she saw a light farther on. She hurried toward it, and suddenly she came to a circle of 12 stones. There was a fire in the midst of the circle, and upon each of the 12 stones sat a man clothed all about in a cloak, with a hood drawn down to his eyes. 3 of the cloaks were of dazzling white, 3 were of tender green, 3 of a golden yellow, and 3 of a rich, deep purple. Dobrunka stopped in astonishment, but she was so cold that after a moment she spoke. "Kind sirs," she said, "may I come to your fire? I am almost perished with the wind and the cold." An old man with a long white beard, who held a staff in his hand, answered her. "Come and welcome," he said. "We are the 12 months of the year, and I am January. Will you tell us who you are and why you come here alone?" "I am Dobrunka," she answered, stretching her hands out to the fire. "I am sent here by Zloboga and her mother to gather violets." "Violets in January?" exclaimed the old man. "What notion is this?" "It is very foolish, I know," replied Dobrunka, "but Zloboga and her mother will beat me if I go back without them." At that the old man handed his staff to a figure clad in green. "This is a matter for you to manage, Brother March," he said. At that the figure in green arose, took the staff, stirred the fire, and rapped gently upon the ground. Immediately the air grew warm, the grass sprang up, the leaves came forth, and all about in the woods the purple violets blossomed. With a cry of delight, Dobrunka gathered all that her hands could hold of the fragrant flowers, and thanking March prettily, she hastened away. When she reached home, Zloboga and her mother were astonished, but Zloboga pinned the blossoms in her dress and went away to the party. She did not say so much as thank you to Dobrunka. The next day, having stayed out late at the party, Zloboga was more than usually cross and hard to please. "Nothing tastes good," she exclaimed as she pushed away her plate. "I wish I had a dish of strawberries. Dobrunka," she added, "where did you find the violets yesterday?" "In the woods," replied Dobrunka. "They were thick upon the ground." "Then go and get me some strawberries," commanded Zloboga. "Nothing else will satisfy me." "Strawberries in January!" exclaimed Dobrunka. "There were no strawberries in the woods." "I care not," said Zloboga with a stamp of her foot. "You must get me a dishful, and come not back till you find them." Once more Dobrunka was pushed out into the cold, and the door was shut and bolted. Frightened and cold, she again made her way to the woods. It was bitterly cold, but when she reached the edge of the woods, she saw again the shining light. She made her way to it, and holding out her hand she said as before, "Kind sirs, may I warm myself at your fire? I am almost perished with cold." Again January bade her welcome, and asked her what she sought. "I am sent for a dishful of strawberries," she said, "though it seems but a foolish errand." "Strawberries in January!" exclaimed the old man. "And will you be beaten if you go back without them?" "Yes, indeed," cried poor Dobrunka, "and the door is bolted against me till I bring them." Then January took his staff and handed it to one of the figures clad in a cloak of gold. "Brother June," he said, "you must manage this." Then June arose, and taking the staff he stirred the fire till all the air grew warm. Then he tapped upon the ground, and the grass grew green, the leaves burst forth, and the earth was dotted with red, red berries. "Oh, oh!" exclaimed Dobrunka, clasping her hands, "how good you are to me!" Then she fell upon her knees, and soon she had filled her apron with the ripe fruit. Thanking June in her prettiest manner, she hastened home, and poured the berries out before Zloboga and her mother. "Where did you find them?" asked Zloboga coldly. And when Dobrunka told her that there were many of them in the woods, she ate them greedily, but not a thank you did she say to Dobrunka. The next day it was apples that Zloboga wanted, and as before Dobrunka was sent to fetch them, and the door was bolted. Again she ran to the woods, facing the cold north wind and stumbling through the drifts of snow. But the bright light still shone, and when she reached it the circle of figures sat about the fire as on the 2 previous days. "May I come again to your fire, kind friends?" asked Dobrunka. "You are welcome," said January, "but what is your errand today?" "Today I must find apples," said Dobrunka, "and I shall be beaten if I bring them not back." Then January handed his staff to a figure clothed in a gown of deep purple, and as he did so he said, "Brother September, this is a matter for you to manage." Then September stirred the fire with the staff, and the air grew warm, and trees put forth their leaves, and the apple trees covered themselves with pink blossoms. Then the petals fell, and in their place hung many red-cheeked apples. "Shake the tree, Dobrunka," said September, and Dobrunka shook the tree. 2 ripe apples fell, and she picked them up, thanked September with a smile, and ran away home. "Only 2 apples!" exclaimed Zloboga as she entered. "Why did you not bring more?" "Only 2 fell when I shook the tree," said Dobrunka. Zloboga and her mother never before had eaten apples of so delicious a flavour. The next morning, Zloboga declared, "I am going to the woods today. I want more of those delicious apples. I am going to find the wonderful tree upon which they grow and shake down all its fruit." "Let Dobrunka bring them to you," said her mother. But Zloboga was wilful, and in spite of the cold and snow, she set out to find the wonderful tree and gather all its fruit. She ran away to the woods, and her mother, fearing that some harm would come to her, followed. But Zloboga did not see the shining light that had guided Dobrunka, and she lost her way in the snow and the cold. Dobrunka wondered and wondered when Zloboga and her mother did not come back, and after many days, for no one ever heard of them again, she became mistress of the little cottage, the cow, the garden, and the chickens. And one day a neighbour's son came to her door and asked her to marry him, and they lived in the little cottage and were happy ever afterward. End of section 3. Recording by James Pinniger.
Section 4 of Favorite Fairy Tales Retold. Favorite Fairy Tales Retold. Inger's Loaf. Once upon a time, a little peasant girl named Inger was sent to the home of a rich family in the country to act as serving maid. Now Inger was a very pretty girl, but she was proud and selfish, and this had caused her father and mother a great deal of sorrow. The rich people to whom she was sent were good to little Inger. They dressed her as prettily as they did their own little daughter, and they treated her as kindly as though she too were their own. One would think that this would have caused Inger to be kind and loving, but instead she became more and more proud and selfish. One day, when she'd been away from her home many months, her employer said to her, "Inger, it is quite time that you visited your father and mother." So Inger put on her very best shoes and her prettiest dress, and away she started. "They will be surprised to see how grand I look," she said to herself as she ran along. When she reached the edge of the village, she saw groups of young men and women walking about and talking, and seated upon a rough stone bench, she saw her own mother. On her mother's back rested a bundle of sticks which she had picked up for fuel. "What will all those people say to see me talking to an old woman with a bundle of sticks on her back?" exclaimed Inger, looking at her own pretty clothes. So without speaking one word to her mother, she turned and ran back to her employer in the country. Many months passed, and then her employer said again, "Little Inger, it is time you visited your father and mother." So once more, Inger put on her very best shoes and her prettiest dress, and just as she was about to start, her employer handed her a fine fresh loaf of wheaten bread. "It is for your father and mother," she said. "They will like the fresh, sweet loaf." Now the peasants lived on coarse oat cakes, and fresh wheaten bread was a very great treat. So Inger took the loaf and started on her way. Presently she came to a spot where the ground was soft and wet. Inger stopped and looked down. "I shall spoil my pretty shoes if I step in the marsh," she said to herself. "I want to look fine when I reach the village. I know what I will do. I will drop this loaf in the marsh and jump upon it. Then I shall keep my shoes quite clean." "But your father and mother would like the wheaten bread," a voice seemed to say. "It will be a rare treat to them, and they ofttimes have to go hungry, you know." Inger looked at the loaf, then she looked at the marsh, and last of all she looked at her shoes. "I cannot help that," she said. "I must save my pretty shoes." With that, she threw the loaf into the marsh and sprang upon it. But when she would have leapt from the loaf to the opposite side of the marsh, she could not. Her feet were held fast by the loaf, and in a moment it sank out of sight and pulled little Inger down with it. And where do you suppose Inger found herself? She found herself in the home of the old marsh wife, who was half-sister to the Elf King. Now the marsh wife and the Elf King live quite close to Bogeyland, and all sorts of queer things happen in that part of the world. But poor Inger was in a sad plight for visiting strange countries. The mud of the marsh had soiled her pretty shoes, her fine dress, and even her face and her hair. "What a dirty-looking child!" exclaimed an old woman who sat in the marsh wife's kitchen. Inger gazed at the old woman, and she did not like her. The old woman was working very fast at the strangest piece of embroidery. It was made entirely of lies, which she wove with rapid fingers. By her side were piled a heap of necklaces. These were made from idle words which she had picked up and strung together. She loved to give these necklaces away, for they always caused the wearers no end of trouble. On the other side of the old woman lay a pile of slippers. She had made them from gadabout leather, and these, too, she loved to give away, for the wearers of them could find no rest. Indeed, she was a very wicked old woman, and Inger began to tremble as she looked at her. Presently, the old woman put down her embroidery and looked at Inger through a pair of very big eyeglasses. It seemed to Inger that with those eyeglasses the old woman could see right into her heart. "Yes," said the old woman at last, "she will make a good statue for my court. May I have her?" "You are quite welcome to her," replied the marsh wife. "I do not know why she came here. What is it that she stands upon?" "It looks like a wheaten loaf," said the old woman. And she was quite right, for Inger's feet were still fast to the loaf, and neither one of them could she move. "A statue," said Inger to herself. "Statues are beautiful. I suppose she wants me because I am pretty." But no sooner had she thought this than she remembered that she was covered with mud, and that the old woman had called her a dirty child. But she had no more time in which to wonder, for the old woman had already gathered up her work and was whisking her away to Bogeyland, for that was where the old woman lived. The next that Inger knew, she was standing, still on her wheaten loaf, in a great court among many other statues, for she was now a statue herself. She could think, and she could turn her eyes and look about, but aside from this, she was as stiff as a stone. The statues about her were not pretty, but they were quite as pretty as poor Inger in her covering of brown mud. Now Inger had plenty of time to think, for she could not run about or talk or play. She could only stand in the old woman's court in Bogeyland. At first, she thought only about herself and of how unhappy she was, but she could not shed a tear, no matter how wretched she felt. She watched the old woman at her work, and she thought of all the unhappiness and trouble she was making for other people. She saw her fashioning her gifts, embroideries of lies and necklaces of idle words and slippers of gadabout leather, and she thought what a wicked woman she was. Then she wondered how all the other statues came to be in the old woman's garden, and if they were as unhappy as she. But after a while, Inger did not give so much time to these unpleasant thoughts. She began to think instead about her father and mother and her kind employer. She remembered how good they had always been to her. Then she remembered how she had turned away from her mother when she had a bundle of sticks upon her back, and how she'd thrown the wheaten loaf into the marsh when her father and mother had perhaps been hungry. All at once she exclaimed within herself, "Why, I am just as bad as this old woman. I was so vain and selfish that I made everyone else unhappy, for I tried only to please myself." The more Inger thought about this, the sorrier she grew, and at last she said, "Oh, if I could only give so much as a wheaten loaf to someone, how happy I should be!" Then something very strange happened. The stiff statue which had been Inger seemed all at once to melt, and away from it there flew a sober little brown bird, and the bird winged its way to the upper air. It was a very quiet, timid little bird, and it could not sing, but it crept into a crevice in a wall and watched the other birds about it. It was winter, and the waters were frozen, and the fields were covered with snow, so the birds could find but little to eat. But on Christmas Day, our little brown bird saw the people of the village tie a sheaf of grain to a pole. Then they raised the pole upright and went away and left it. And oh, how the birds flocked around and ate the grain, for that was just what the people had wished. The little brown bird hopped out with the rest and ate a kernel of wheat. Then a happy thought came to it, and away it flew. It flew along the roads where loads of grain had jolted. It lighted outside kitchen windows where crumbs were thrown, and everywhere that it went it ate just one kernel or one crumb, and it called the other birds to come and take all the rest. Here and there the little brown bird flew, hunting for food and calling the other birds whenever it found a bit to eat. It was a very happy bird. Its only sorrow was that it could not sing. But one day, when it had divided a single crumb with a tiny wren, the little brown bird heard a voice say, "Little brown bird, you've given away enough crumbs and seeds to make a whole wheaten loaf." At that, the little brown bird felt something throbbing in its throat, and the next moment it was pouring forth a beautiful song of thanksgiving, a song so sweet and pure and clear that the children playing in a nearby yard stopped to listen. And as they looked, the bird lifted its wings, and it was all pure white, and it flew happily away into the sky. End of Section 4. Section 5 of Favorite Fairy Tales Retold. Ole Shut-Eyes and His Dream Umbrella. Night is drawing on, and little Heilmar is sitting quietly by the fireside on a little footstool. Now Heilmar does not hear a single footfall, but just the same, someone is coming up the stairs. Someone in a coat of silk that shimmers all red and blue and green. It is Ole Shut-Eyes, the wonderful teller of dreams. He has taken off his shoes so he will not be heard, and he opens the door so that not a sound reaches Heilmar's ears. Puff! Before Heilmar can raise his eyes to look, Ole Shut-Eyes has sent into them an invisible spray, and then Heilmar's lids close, his head droops, and he is carried off to bed. But Ole Shut-Eyes steals softly in after him and sits down beside his bed. Heilmar has been a good boy all day, so Ole takes from under his arm a beautiful umbrella all covered with pictures, and he raises it over Heilmar's bed. Ole Shut-Eyes carries two kinds of umbrellas. One is for naughty children, and it has no beautiful pictures at all, and then there are no beautiful dreams. But Heilmer's umbrella has wonderful pictures, and Ole begins at once to tell him about them. "First," said Ole Shut-Eyes, "I'm going to make things smart." As he said this, the plants in the pots in Heilmer's room stretched up into trees. The branches blossomed forth with wonderful roses, and all the room looked like a lovely arbor. There was fruit on the trees too, and it tasted like the richest jam, and the vines were covered with buns, just bursting with plums. Oh, it was delightful. But in the midst of all these wonders, there came a noise of grumbling, and it came from a drawer in the table. It was the drawer in which Heilmer kept his school books and slate. Ole Shut-Eyes opened the drawer. The slate was twisting itself into the most wretched shapes. "What is all this?" exclaimed Ole. "Oh, I am in great misery," said the slate. "There's a wrong figure in one of my sums, and try as I may, I cannot change it." A little pencil tied to the slate by a bit of string was tugging with all its might. "I would change the figure if I could," it cried in a creaky voice, "but I can't." At that, the copybook began to lament. Ole turned the leaves. He saw a nice stiff row of capital letters and a nice stiff row of little letters. These were the letters that were printed in the book. But beyond these were other letters that Heilmer had made. They leaned this way and they leaned that way, and some of them were almost tumbling off the line on which they were supposed to stand. Ole Shut-Eyes looked closely at them. He could see that Heilmer had tried to make them like the copy, but his small fingers could not make the lines go where they should. "We would like to be stiff and straight," wailed the letters, "but we are so crooked we can't stand up." "Dear me," said Ole Shut-Eyes, "I shall have to give you a dose of medicine." Oh, no, no," cried all the letters together, and they stood up as stiff as anything. "Now I will drill you like soldiers," said Ole. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Oh, how stiff they stood as they marched up and down the page. But I must tell you that the next morning, when Heilmer awoke and opened his copybook, they were just as crooked as ever, and the sum hadn't come right either. The next thing that Ole Shut-Eyes did was to touch a picture that was upon the wall, and the painted birds in the trees began to fly about and sing. The grass and flowers nodded in the breeze, and the river began flowing toward the sea. Heilmer put his foot up into the picture, and there he stood under the trees. Before him on the water was a little boat, painted red and blue, and it had silver sails. Heilmer stepped into it, and away it sailed down the stream. Pretty fishes splashed about in the water and swam after the red and blue boat. The fishes had scales of silver and gold. Birds sang to Heilmer as he passed through deep woods, and the trees told him stories, dark stories about robbers and witches. Then the little boat sailed past an open space where there was a neat cottage. A young woman came out of the cottage and sang a song to him, and she was the woman who had been Heilmer's nurse, and the song she sang was one she had sung to him many, many times before, when she had held him in her arms. As the song died away, the woman and the boat both seemed to vanish. The next that Heilmer knew, Ole Shut-Eyes was introducing him to a little gray mouse that was on her way to a wedding. "Two of the mice who live beneath your mother's pantry floor are to be married tonight," said the mouse politely. "Would you like to attend the wedding?" "Very much," said Heilmer. "But how am I to get there? I'm too big to go through a mouse hole." "Leave that to me," said Ole Shut-Eyes, and in a twinkling Heilmer found himself even smaller than a mouse. He hastily put on his tin soldier's uniform, which fitted perfectly and was very grand. "Now step into this thimble of your mother's," said the mouse. "I will make an excellent carriage, and I will draw you to the wedding." So Heilmer seated himself in the thimble and was driven away to the wedding. Perhaps the thimble carriage was a teeny bit small. At any rate, Heilmer turned over in his bed and muttered, "Are there any more stories?" "There's no more time for stories," said Ole. "Tomorrow is Sunday, and I must get the world all polished up. First of all, I must see that the brownies up in the church tower are burnishing the bells. They must ring clear and true to call the people to worship. I must see that the breezes have brushed the dust from the grass and flowers. They must be fresh and sweet. Those things are easily attended to," said Ole. "But it isn't so easy to polish the stars. You see," he continued. "First of all, I have to get them down and take them in my apron to polish them. But it doesn't do to be careless. No, indeed. I must number each star and each star hole so that I can put them back in their proper places. If I didn't do that, they would not stick, and we should have too many falling stars." At that, the picture of Heilmer's great-grandfather, which hung upon the wall of the room, spoke. "Now, I say, Mr. Shut-Eyes," it said, "I am quite willing that you should tell Heilmer stories, but really, you must not puzzle his brains with such stories as this. The stars cannot be taken down to be polished, you know. They are planets, like our Earth." But old Shut-Eyes smiled wisely. "Thank you, great-grandfather," he said, "but I am much older than you, and I know many things which you would not believe. However," he added, "if you do not approve of my stories, you may tell some yourself." And with that, old Shut-Eyes folded up his dream umbrella and vanished. And Heilmer determined that the next night he would turn great-grandfather's picture to the wall. End of Section 5.
Section 6 of Favorite Fairy Tales Retold. Favorite Fairy Tales Retold by Julia Darrow Cowles. The Nightingale, from Andersen. Many long years ago, the Emperor of China made a very great discovery. He was reading in a book, which was a very unusual thing for him to do, and he read the words, "But the most wonderful thing in all the Empire of China is the song of the nightingale." "What is this?" cried the Emperor. "The nightingale in my own empire, and I have never met her? Who is she? I must find her. I must hear her sing. It is strange," he added, "that people of other countries know more about my empire than I do myself. Now and then one may really learn something from books." So the Emperor summoned a lord-in-waiting and said to him, "I have just read about the song of the nightingale, but I do not know her. See that she appears at court this evening. I must hear her sing." The lord-in-waiting bowed very low and hastened away. He never had heard of the nightingale either, and had no idea where she was to be found. But he ran all through the castle, upstairs and down, through corridors and chambers, and everywhere he inquired about the nightingale, but no one knew who she was, or where she could be found. The lord-in-waiting bowed low before the Emperor and told him this. "What?" exclaimed the Emperor. "The song of the nightingale is the most wonderful thing in my kingdom, and no one knows who she is? She must be brought to the court this evening. If she is not, the whole court shall be trampled upon." "Sing Pei," cried the lord-in-waiting, and again he searched the castle, and half the court ran after him, for they did not want to be trampled upon. At length a simple little kitchen maid heard the uproar, and timidly she said, "I know the nightingale. I can show you where she lives. Indeed, I have often heard her sing." At that the whole court set out on the heels of the lord-in-waiting, and he in turn ran after the little kitchen maid. They left the castle, passed through the beautiful gardens of the Emperor, and at last found themselves in the deep green woods. None of the court ever had been there before. Then the little kitchen maid pointed to a small gray bird perched upon the branch of a tree. "There is the nightingale," she said. The lord-in-waiting could scarcely recover from his surprise. He never had dreamed that the nightingale would prove to be a sober little gray bird. But he delivered the Emperor's message and bade the little bird appear at court that evening. "I sing best among the green trees," said the nightingale, "but if the Emperor wishes, I will come." The castle was decorated for the occasion, and a wonderful golden cage was made for the nightingale. At the appointed time she came, and when she sang, her song was so clear and pure and sweet that tears formed in the Emperor's eyes and ran down upon his cheeks. When she had finished, the Emperor was so pleased that he said she should remain at court. She should live in the golden cage and should have many attendants to wait upon her. He even offered to hang his golden slipper about her neck, but this the nightingale declined. She would have been much happier in her home in the green wood, but what the Emperor commands must be done. So she lived at court in a golden cage, close beside the Emperor's couch, and she sang whenever the Emperor commanded. One day a packet came addressed to the Emperor. "Perhaps it is another book," said he. But when it was opened, he found not a book, but a most marvelous bird. It was made of silver and gold, studded with precious jewels, and inside the bird were springs and wheels, so that when they were wound, the bird could sing. Truly, this were a new marvel, and when the emperor had heard the jeweled bird sing, he cared no more for the true nightingale, and she was allowed to fly away to her home in the green woods. The jeweled bird was placed in the golden cage, and the golden slipper was hung about her neck. Many times a day the golden bird was wound and made to sing for the emperor. It was much grander than a living bird, for anyone could hear a living bird sing. But one morning, when the attendant wound the springs, there was a sudden whir. The spring had broken. The jeweled bird could sing no more. It was sent away to be mended, but no one in all the emperor's kingdom knew how to repair it. A watchmaker did the best that he could, but after that it could only be wound once a year, and then it had to be done very carefully. Many, many moons passed, and then one day it was whispered that the emperor was very ill. It was not thought that he could live. He lay very still and white on his silken couch, and his attendants were frightened and thought him dead. So they hastened away to tell the people that the emperor was dead. But when they had gone, the emperor turned his head toward the little golden bird and whispered, "Music, I want music." But the little bird could not sing, for there was no one there to wind it. "Music, you little golden bird," whispered the emperor. "I have loaded you with gifts. Sing to me now." But the jeweled bird could not sing. The emperor turned his head. What was that at the open window? The little gray nightingale had heard that the emperor was ill, and she had flown to the window to sing to him. And in a moment her sweet, clear song filled all the room with melody. She sang of life and hope, and as she sang, the emperor's cheeks grew ruddy and his strength returned. The door opened and the attendants came softly in to care for the dead emperor. But what was their astonishment when he arose and said, "Good morning." End of section 6.
Section 7 of Favorite Fairy Tales Retold. The Six Swans, from Grimm. Once upon a time there were 7 children who lived alone in a great castle, hidden deep in the heart of a forest. 6 of the children were boys, the 7th was a girl. Their father was the king who ruled over the country, and he loved his children dearly. But to save his own life, after the death of the queen, their mother, he was forced to marry a woman who was a witch. He knew well that she would not be kind to his children, so he placed them in the castle in the forest and went secretly to visit them as often as he could. But after a time the witch wife began to wonder who it was that the king went away to see. So she gave a sum of money to one of the servants, and the servant told her about the children of the king, and how she could find her way to the castle in the forest. So one day when the king had gone out hunting, the witch wife followed the secret path through the forest, and when she came near the castle she made a great tramping as though a heavy man were walking. The sister, who was busy in the house, did not hear, but the 6 boys who were outside heard his footsteps, and thinking that it was their father coming, ran down the path to meet him. Then the witch wife threw over each one a little white shirt, and as soon as the shirts touched them, they were changed into white swans, and they flew away to the water. Now the servant had not told how many children the king had, so the witch wife supposed that she had changed them all into swans, and she went away home satisfied. But the king's little daughter had looked from the window of the castle just in time to see her brothers changed into swans, and had watched them fly away. She was quite broken-hearted at the sight, and went sadly about the castle all day. But at evening she heard a fluttering of wings, and suddenly 6 white swans flew down to the castle and lighted before her. They blew upon one another, and their feathers were stripped off like coats, and her 6 brothers stood before her in their own forms. One of them spoke quickly. "We can remove our coats with swan feathers and resume our own forms for only 15 minutes, he said. "But what can I do to help you?" exclaimed their sister, wiping away her tears. "Is there no way that I can bring you back to stay?" "The way is too difficult," answered one of the brothers. "But tell me," exclaimed the girl. "There is but one way," replied her brother. "For 6 years you must let no word of sound fall from your lips, and during the 6 years you must stitch together leaves of the starwort and make us 6 shirts. But it is too difficult," he added. "You cannot do it." Then, as the 15 minutes were spent, the 6 brothers resumed the form of swans and flew away from the castle. "I will do it," said the sister, and then she closed fast her lips and ran away from the castle. She travelled a long distance till she came to the place where the starwort grew. Then she picked a quantity of leaves and began to sew. Day after day she spent picking the leaves of starwort and sewing them with the finest stitches possible. No word passed her lips, and she neither sang nor laughed. One day, while she was thus occupied, a prince with his retinue passed her as she worked. The prince turned back and spoke, but though the maiden smiled, she shook her head and said no word. The prince was puzzled, but no answer could he get to his questioning. Day after day he came back, for the silent maiden fascinated him, and at last he asked her to marry him. She shook her head and laid her finger on her silent lips, but she smiled as she did so, and the prince became the more determined to make her his bride. Each day he came to see her, and she began to watch for his coming and to count the hours after he had gone. Then, one day, when he again begged her to marry him, she smiled and laid her hand in his. The prince was so happy that he sent at once for a priest, and they were married, and he led her to his father's house. But though she was so happy, the wife did not speak, and each day she sewed on the shirts of starwort. But the queen, the mother of the prince, did not like the choice that he had made, and, as she was a wicked woman, she invented evil stories about his wife, and told them to the prince. At last the queen convinced him that his wife was a witch, and, though he still loved her, and it almost broke his heart to do it, he was obliged to consent to the queen's plan that his wife be placed in a dungeon and left there the remainder of her life. When he told his girl wife this, she threw her arms about him, and tears rained down her face. But no sound passed her lips. Then they wept together, and although the prince told her that he loved her as well as ever, he said that the king and queen had determined that she must be sent to the dungeon, and he could not alter their plan. With trembling hands, the young wife gathered up the 6 little shirts of starwort, for she had almost completed the last one. Only a sleeve remained unfinished, for the 6th year was almost past. As they led her out of the castle, there was heard a sudden rush of wings, and 6 beautiful swans lighted in the path before her, for at that moment the 6th year was ended. Instantly she threw over them the 6 shirts of starwort, and immediately the coats of feathers dropped off, and 6 handsome young men stood in the path, though one of them, on whom the unfinished shirt had fallen, had a swan's wing in place of one arm. Then their sister turned with a glad cry to her husband the prince, and told him of the enchantment which the witch wife had thrown over her brothers, and of the penance she had done to break the enchantment. Then the prince took her in his arms, and led her and her brothers back to the castle, where there was great feasting and rejoicing, and the prince loved his wife more dearly than ever. End of Section 7. Recording by Esther Camus.
Section number 8 of Favorite Fairy Tales Retold. The Enchanted Mead, a Korean folk tale. Once upon a time, there was an old woman lived upon a river bank, where the ferry boats crossed. She was poor, and often had only a bowl of rice for her dinner. She had no family, unless one may call a faithful dog and a mischievous cat a family. But dog Trophy, Thomas the cat, and the old woman lived very happily, and were the best of friends. It was only now and then that they went hungry to bed. One day a stranger stopped at the old woman's cottage. "I am weary and thirsty," he said. "Can you give me refreshment?" Now the old woman had only a bit of bread and one last sup of mead, but seeing the stranger's weariness, she offered them heartily. "Thank you," said the stranger when he had finished. "I cannot offer you money, but if you will drop this bit of amber into your jug, you will never find it empty of mead." And handing the old woman a clear, yellow stone, he disappeared. Wondering and curious, the old woman dropped a bit of amber into the jug. At once, the jug felt heavy, for it was full of mead. The old woman was delighted, and so plainly did she show her joy, that dog Trophy and Thomas the cat seemed to understand her good fortune, and capered about to express their pleasure. Now good times came to the little cottage, for, since the jug was always full, yet required no filling, the old woman set up a little shop where travelers, crossing the ferry, could stop for a bit of bread and a sup of mead. The cat and the dog often talked things over at night, and they understood about the magic bit of amber, for not once had they gone to bed supperless since the stranger had left the curious stone. The jug was always guarded by one of the three. But one day the old woman took up the jug, and it was empty. She shook it. No merry stone tinkled against its side. Then the old woman knew that in pouring the mead for a customer, the bit of amber must have been poured out too. But into whose cup or jug it had gone, she had not the least idea. She was filled with despair. "I have no other means of support," she said sadly. "Must I go hungry again in my old age?" Dog Trophy's lively expression changed to one of deep woe, and his tail dropped dejectedly. Thomas the cat lost his usually cheerful grin, and lashed his sides with a bristling tail. At night, as usual, they talked matters over. "I know," said Thomas, "that I could find the bit of stone by the smell, if I could get somewhere near it. But how is one to begin?" "We will set out," said Dog Trophy, "and visit every house in the neighborhood. Let us start at once, while our old mistress sleeps." "Ready," said Thomas, and off they went. They visited every house on that side of the river, but not once did Thomas get a whiff of the precious amber. "The river is frozen," said Trophy at length. "Let us cross to the other side. We have spent many nights in searching, but we must not give up yet." So together they crossed the river, for the ice was firm, and began their search on the farther side. Dog Trophy made the acquaintance of all the dogs, while Thomas went inside and called upon the house cats. One night, as he was walking stealthily along a beam in one of the houses, he caught a sniff of the longed-for odor. It told him that the stone was near, and he was so delighted that he almost lost his hold upon the beam. But it was well that he did not, for he would have fallen straight upon the bald head of the man who owned the house. He regained his balance and followed the scent, which grew stronger and stronger the farther he went. At last he came to a heavy box, the cover of which was fitted so closely that he could not move it. Try as he would, the cover could not be raised. So Thomas went outside to consult with Dog Trophy. "The box cannot be moved, and the lid cannot be lifted," said Thomas, "but I am sure the stone is inside." "There is but one thing to do then," said Dog Trophy, who was very wise. "And what is that?" asked Thomas, respectfully. "Get the mice to gnaw a hole in the box," said Trophy. At that, Thomas grinned. "And how will we win a favor from the mice? We who chase and eat them on every occasion." "Let us sign an agreement not to touch a rat or a mouse for a whole year," said Trophy. And that is what they did, though they had some trouble in getting a hearing with the mice. But it was a very good bargain, the mice admitted, and so a hole was gnawed in the box, and a very small mouse squeezed through and brought out the bit of amber. How Dog Trophy and Thomas the cat rejoiced, and how glad their mistress would be! They hurried down to the river bank, but when they reached the river, they saw that the ice was gone. Spring had come while they were carrying on their search. There was no way for them to get back, except to swim. But Thomas, of course, could not swim. But Dog Trophy was never at a loss for a plan. "Get on my back," he said, "and hold that bit of amber in your mouth. Whatever happens, do not lose the amber. I will carry you safe across." With that, he plunged into the water, while Thomas clung fast to his long hair. Thomas wanted to laugh at this new way of riding, but he dared not, for fear he might lose the stone. They were almost across when a sudden splash of water flew straight into Thomas's face. He sneezed, when down dropped the precious stone into the river. Trophy saw it go and dived for it, and such a wetting as Thomas got, but the stone had disappeared. Thomas got to the bank somehow, and ran up a tree to dry his fur. Then he arched his back, and spit at Dog Trophy for giving him such a ducking, while Dog Trophy barked furiously up the tree at Thomas for losing the precious stone. When he had barked his throat quite raw, Dog Trophy went sadly down to the river bank. A man was standing near fishing. Presently the fisherman drew out a large fish and thoughtlessly threw it upon the bank. A familiar scent greeted Dog Trophy's nostrils, and instantly he caught up the fish and dashed away with it to his mistress. The old woman was glad indeed to see her faithful dog, and glad also of a good meal of fish. But when she opened the fish to dress it, what do you suppose she found? Her precious bit of amber lay in the stomach of the fish. There was happiness and plenty in the little cottage once more, but Dog Trophy and Thomas the cat have never been good friends since. End of Section 8. Recording by Greg Giordano, Newport Richey, Florida.
Section 9 of Favorite Fairy Tales Retold. Favorite Fairy Tales Retold, The White Cat, from Dolnoy. Once upon a time, many years ago, a little girl was given by her mother to the fairies, and they were to bring her up. The fairies were good to her, and she was very happy. She grew up and was accomplished and very beautiful. She was a princess, for her father was a king and her mother was a queen. But one day, the princess disobeyed the fairies and made them very angry with her. So, for a punishment, they changed her into a beautiful white cat. They gave her a palace to live in, a most wonderful palace, which was lighted by the sparkling of hundreds of precious jewels, and a retinue of servants to wait upon her. But each servant, like herself, had been changed into the form of a cat. One day there came to the palace a young man, a prince, who had been sent away from home on a strange errand. His father, who was king of a distant country, had sent him out to find the most remarkable dog in all the world. The prince had traveled far when he saw the beautiful palace with walls of glass, having all the tints of the rainbow, doors of gold, and lights formed by dazzling sapphires, rubies, and emeralds. Never had the prince seen so marvelous a building, and he rang a bell at the entrance, wondering as he did so who could it be that lived in the midst of such luxury and beauty. What was his surprise then, upon being admitted to the palace, to discover that all the inmates were cats. But never had he been treated with greater hospitality. A beautiful room was placed at his disposal, a bath of perfumed water was prepared, and later a dinner of the richest foods was set before him. He noticed, however, that 2 plates were laid at the table, and he wondered with whom he was to dine. But while he wondered, a beautiful white cat came gracefully into the room and took her seat at the table. "Prince," she said, addressing him, "I hope my servants have made you comfortable. While we eat, will you tell me from what country you come and something of your journey?" The prince was filled with amazement, but he was careful not to show his surprise. He told her of the strange errand upon which he had been sent by his father, the king. "I have a year in which to find the most remarkable dog in the world," he added. "Make yourself comfortable here as long as you like," said the white cat graciously. "Perhaps you may find the dog you are in search of nearby." The prince thanked her, for he was charmed by her gracious manner, and filled also with curiosity. He lingered at the palace day after day, for it was the most wonderful and the most beautiful place that he had ever seen, and each day he wondered more and more at the charm and good breeding of the white cat, and at her many accomplishments. But one morning the thought came suddenly to him that he had but 3 days more in which to find the most remarkable dog in the world, and return with it to his father's castle. He was filled with remorse at having lingered so long. "Do not regret your stay," said the white cat. "I have found for you the most remarkable dog in the world, and you shall take it to your father." With that she handed him an acorn. The prince, in wonder, held the acorn to his ear, and to his joy and amazement heard within it the faint barking of a dog. Bidding the white cat farewell, he hastened to the king, and in his presence opened the acorn. Out jumped the tiniest and most perfect little dog imaginable. It could easily jump through a lady's finger ring. The king was delighted and wanted all his court to see the wonderful dog. But a few days later he again called his son to him and said, "My son, I must have a piece of muslin fine enough to be drawn through the eye of a needle. You, I am sure, can find it for me. You may have a year in which to secure it." The prince was rather glad of another opportunity to travel, for of course he went directly to the palace of the white cat, and to her he told his second quest. "Have no fear," said she. "My servants can produce the muslin for you, and we shall be glad to entertain you until it is time for you to return to your father." So for another year the prince remained in the palace of the white cat, enjoying the beauty and comfort of its wonderful gardens, its baths, and its works of art. But most of all, the prince enjoyed the company of the white cat, whom he found more intelligent, more witty, and more charming in manner than any lady of his father's court. At the end of the second year, the white cat came to him, and placing in his hand an apple seed, said, "You must return now to your father's castle. Open the seed in his presence, for it contains the object of your search." "But how can I leave you, my good friend?" said the prince sorrowfully, "and how can I ever repay you?" "You may be sent upon a third quest," said the white cat in a soft voice. "To have you return will fully repay me." So the prince rode away to his father, and when he reached the castle and opened the apple seed, he drew forth 400 yards of muslin, so fine that it could easily be drawn through the eye of the finest needle. The king was delighted and filled with wonder, but yet he was not satisfied. "You must go upon one more quest, my son," he said, "and then, if you are successful, I will give you my kingdom, and you shall rule in my stead. Bring back with you at the end of a year the most beautiful princess in all the world, and the kingdom shall be yours." So once more the prince set out, straight to the palace of the white cat. But this time he was sad as he repeated his father's words. "Have no fear," said the white cat. "All will be well at the end of the year." But never did a year pass so quickly as this one. There were feasts and music, fireworks, and 1,000 entertainments provided by the attendants of the white cat. It lacked but a few days of time for the prince's return, when he exclaimed sorrowfully, "I would rather stay with you, dear white cat, than marry the most beautiful princess in the world and rule over my father's kingdom. Become a mortal for my sake, or use some magic to turn me also into a cat." At the words a sudden flash blinded the prince, and when he again looked, there stood before him not the white cat, but a girl of radiant beauty. With a dazzling smile she cried, "You have broken by your words the spell which the fairies threw over me. I am indeed a princess, but when I angered the fairies, they changed me into the form of a white cat." As she spoke, her attendants, who had also been changed back to their human forms, came into the room, and they made the princess ready, and she went with the happy prince to the castle of his father the king, where they were married and lived happily ever after. End of Section 9. Section 10 of Favorite Fairy Tales Retold. The Miller's Daughter, a Slav Folktale. Once upon a time, there was born to a rich nobleman a beautiful baby boy, and there was great rejoicing and feasting in the castle. When the nobleman's friends came together for the christening, the fairies came too. Each fairy brought a gift, but one of them was in a bad humor, and when it was her turn to bestow her gift, she said, "Your son shall grow to manhood only upon one condition: his feet must not touch the floor before he is 12 years of age." The nobleman was greatly distressed at this, but it could not be altered, so he had a cradle made of gold, with high sides, and he hired the most careful nurses in all the country around to wait upon and watch his boy. And the boy grew, and was strong and sturdy, and everyone about the castle loved him and watched over him carefully. At last his 12th birthday drew near, and his father ordered a splendid feast. There was a great bustle of preparation while everyone rejoiced. But in the midst of this happiness and confusion, there came a sudden noise of grief and crying, and the walls of the castle began to tremble and shake. At this, the attendant who was with the boy became quite frantic with fear. She jumped to her feet to see what all this could mean, and the boy fell to the floor. Instantly the cries ceased. The walls of the castle stood firm as before, but the nobleman's son could not be found. Search was made everywhere, but no trace of him was left. The nobleman offered a reward of 300 crowns in gold to anyone who could bring him news of his son, but no one came to claim the reward. Then the nobleman shut himself up in his castle. His gardens were neglected, and all his joys seemed gone. Now at a little distance from the nobleman's castle there lived a miller with his wife and 3 daughters. One day the oldest daughter went for a walk in the woods. She grew very tired and was wishing for a place to rest, when close beside her path she saw a neglected summer house that belonged to the estate of the nobleman. She pushed aside the vines and bushes, and as she did, she discovered, fastened to the door of the summer house, a notice, long yellowed by the sun and rain. It was the offer of 300 crowns in gold for news of the nobleman's son. "I wish I might earn the reward," said the girl. "It would make me a fine dowry, and then I could marry well." She pushed open the door, and what was her surprise to see a fire laid ready to light, a table set with dainty food, and a couch draped with fine tapestries. Over the fireplace some letters were carved which read, "Of comforts here partake, but of thy speech beware." "Of comforts here partake," she repeated, "then I may rest and eat." She sat down to taste the food, but as she did so, there came a sound of sighing and crying. She was frightened, but when she turned toward the door, a young man stood before her. "For whom are the fire and the food and the couch?" asked he. "For myself," answered the girl proudly. As she said this, the young man looked troubled. Then, as suddenly as he had come, he was gone. When the girl turned again, the fire, the table, and the couch had vanished as completely as the young man had done. She returned home, but she said nothing to her sisters about her adventure. A few days later, the second daughter took a walk through the woods, and she too, becoming weary, chanced upon the same summer house. The notice was still upon the door, and as she read it, she said, "I wish that I might gain the reward. I could dress well all the rest of my life upon 300 gold crowns, and I should have rich friends." She pushed open the door, and to her surprise found a fire laid ready to light, a table spread with dainty food, and a richly draped couch. And over the fireplace she read the words, "Of comforts here partake, but of thy speech beware." She was very hungry, and as she was used to plain and simple fare, she sat down at once at the daintily laid table. But before a mouthful of food had touched her lips, she heard sighs and a sound of weeping. Springing up, she faced a young man who said to her, "For whom is the fire laid?" "For myself," answered the girl. "For whom is the table spread?" he asked. "For myself," she answered again. "And for whom is the couch prepared?" he asked again. "For myself," was the reply. The young man sighed, looked troubled, then vanished from sight. And when the girl turned back, nothing was to be seen of the fire, the daintily set table, or the couch. But neither did she say anything at home of the strange adventure. Several days passed, and then the youngest daughter went for a walk in the woods. She too chanced upon the summer house, as her sisters had done. "I wish I might win the reward," she said as she read the weather-stained notice upon the door. Father should have a new wheel for his mill, and Mother should have a silk gown. She pushed open the door and saw to her surprise the fire, the table, and the couch. Then she read the words, "Of comforts here partake, but of thy speech beware." "Why, these are for me then," she said, "and one should always be careful of his speech." She lighted the fire and sat down at the table, but as she did so she heard a sound of sighing and crying. She turned about, and there stood a young man. "For whom is the fire?" he asked, looking troubled. "You are welcome to warm yourself by it," said the girl. "And for whom is the table prepared?" "For you, if you are hungry," she replied. "And for whom is the couch made ready?" he questioned again. "For you, if you are weary," she answered once more. At that the young man's face lighted with joy. "Ah," he cried, "I am the lost son of the nobleman in the great castle. The fairy threw a spell over me, and I could not return to my father until some mortal showed me a kindness. You have done so. Come." He took the miller's youngest daughter by the hand and led her to his father. The nobleman was happy beyond words. The miller had his new mill wheel, the miller's wife had a new silk gown. The nobleman's son took the miller's youngest daughter for his bride, and they all lived happily ever after. End of section 10.
Section 11. Our favorite fairy tales retold. The Beauty and the Beast, from Villeneuve. Once upon a time, there was a rich merchant who had 3 daughters. The youngest was called Beauty, because she was so kind and lovable and pretty. But the 2 older daughters were proud and selfish. One day the merchant received a letter which called him away from home. When he left, he asked each of his daughters what he should bring her when he returned. The eldest asked for a necklace of pearls. The second wanted a dress of silk embroidered in gold. But Beauty gave her father a kiss and said, "I think I should like best of all a bunch of beautiful roses." The merchant reached the city, and there he received bad news. His ships had been lost in a storm, and all his wealth had vanished. He returned homeward, sad and discouraged. "I must now move into the little cottage on the farm which I own," he said to himself, "for I have lost everything else. Beauty will not mind," he added. "She will keep the cottage neat and love me as much as ever. But my 2 older daughters will be cross and unhappy. Woe is me, that I have lost my wealth." As he went on with these sorrowful thoughts for company, he looked up and saw before him a light. He was weary and hungry, so he followed the light and was amazed to come upon a beautiful palace set in the midst of the forest. But no one answered when he knocked, and at last he made bold to enter. He went from room to room, but no one appeared. At last he came to a room in which there was a table richly spread for but a single person. "Surely this is a fairy palace," he exclaimed, and he sat down to eat. When he had finished, he looked further, and found a bed all prepared as though ready for a guest. So he thankfully undressed and had a night's sound sleep. In the morning he searched again for the owner of the palace, but finding no one, he ate the breakfast which was bountifully set out, and then he prepared to leave. As he walked through an arbor upon which hung the most beautiful roses he ever had seen, he suddenly remembered Beauty's request. "I cannot take home a necklace of pearls, or a gold embroidered gown," he said sadly, "but I can take a bunch of roses to Beauty." With that he reached up and broke off a full cluster, but at the same instant he heard a terrible roar, and in the path before him there appeared a most hideous beast. "I gave you food and lodging," said the beast, "but I allow no one to touch my roses. The penalty for breaking them is death." The frightened merchant fell upon his knees and pleaded with the beast. He told him about Beauty, and that it was only for her sake that he had broken off the beautiful flowers. "Very well," said the beast, "I will let you go home upon one condition. You must promise to return in a week's time. If one of your daughters chooses to come in your place, then you may go free." The poor merchant promised faithfully to return and hastened away. He was glad that he could see his daughters once more, before he could be slain by the terrible beast. But he was sad at heart as he journeyed toward his home. Upon reaching there, he told his daughters how he had lost his wealth, and that they must move into the little cottage on the farm. Then, handing the bunch of roses to Beauty, he told them the story of the beast and of his promise to return. The older daughters bemoaned the loss of all their father's wealth, and blamed Beauty for the added trouble her roses had brought upon them all. But Beauty threw her arms about her father's neck and said, "I shall go in your place, dear father." "No, no," he cried. But Beauty could not be turned from her purpose, and when at the end of the week her father started for the palace of the beast, Beauty went by his side. "Did you come of your own accord?" asked the beast in a terrible voice when he saw her. "Yes," replied Beauty, turning pale and trembling, for the beast was very ugly to look upon. But when Beauty went through the palace, she found that the most beautiful rooms of all were marked Beauty's rooms, and she said to her father, "Perhaps the beast will not kill me, after all. Why should these rooms be made ready for me, if I am not to live here?" So her father went back home somewhat comforted. That evening, when Beauty's supper was made ready, the beast came to eat with her. Beauty trembled and could scarcely swallow a mouthful, though the food was the finest and best she ever had tasted. "Do you think me very ugly, Beauty?" asked the beast. "Yes," replied Beauty, "but you may be very kind." "Will you marry me, Beauty?" asked the beast. "Oh no," said Beauty with a shudder. "I could not do that." Everything possible was done at the palace to make Beauty comfortable and happy, but every evening the beast came to eat with her, and every evening he asked her the same question, "Beauty, will you marry me?" And every evening Beauty answered, "No." But the beast was so kind and good to her that Beauty did not think so much now about how ugly he looked, and she began to feel sorry for him. He looked so sad when she answered, "No." The beast had placed a magic mirror in Beauty's room, and when she looked in it, she had only to wish, and she could see whatever she desired. One day she said to herself, "I wish I could see what they are doing at home and how my father is." Then she looked in her magic mirror, and there she saw her father lying ill in the little farm cottage, while her sister sat by looking cross and sulky, and the room was in dreadful disorder. "Oh, dear beast!" she exclaimed, when he came in to supper that night. "My father is ill at home, for he fears that I am dead. He needs me. May I not go to him and comfort him?" "Will you come back to me, Beauty?" asked the beast. "I cannot live without you." Beauty readily promised that she would come back in a week, Then the Beast slipped a ring upon her finger and said, "You have only to turn the ring 3 times on your finger and wish, and you will be at home. Turn it again 3 times and wish, when you are ready to return. But remember," he added, "that if you do not return when you promise, I shall die." So Beauty promised again, thanked the Beast, and turning her ring, found herself at once in her father's cottage. How thankful her father was to see her alive! It made him quite well at once. Then Beauty, although she was dressed in the beautiful garments which the Beast had given her, went about setting the cottage to rights, while her sisters plied her with all sorts of questions about the Beast, his palace, and the wonderful gifts that he showered upon her. They were quite ill-natured and envious, but Beauty was light-hearted and merry, and her father wondered how he ever could let her leave him again. In fact, there was so much work to be done to make things comfortable, and her father and sisters played so hard for her to remain, that Beauty stayed on until she had been gone 10 days. Then at night she had a dream, and in her dream she saw the Beast lying in his bower of roses, ill and suffering. She wakened, and filled with unhappiness, she turned her ring 3 times, and wished herself back. At once she found herself in the bower, kneeling beside the Beast. "Oh, dear Beast," she exclaimed, "have I killed you by my thoughtlessness, when you have been so good and kind to me?" The Beast opened his eyes. "I should have died without you," he said. "Beauty, will you marry me?" "Yes, dear Beast," said Beauty, "for I have learned to love you for your goodness and kindness." Instantly the covering of fur fell from the Beast, and he arose and stood before her, no longer a beast but a handsome prince, clothed in garments of silver, for Beauty's words had broken his enchantment. So they were married, and lived happily ever after. End of section 11.